Welcome to Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. This week's guest is Stephen Fratus. This is a special episode that I'm calling Drinks with Dardi, where Stephen and I sit down, pour ourselves a drink, and just have a casual conversation about the Bolognese system. Enjoy.
Cheers.
Thanks, man. Cheers, brother. All right. So,
Yeah.
hey,
What
how you
do you
doing?
want to talk about?
Everything, man. I mean, lately you've been doing some really cool stuff. So I
You
just
think
kind
so?
of
All
want
right,
to,
cool.
I want you, I want you to tell me a little bit about what you do in Stringere, because I'm curious.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I got to give you the big picture. All right. So I really hate getting stabbed. Okay.
Yeah.
And so all my
I'm right there with you, man.
interpretations are really big and like I don't want to get hit, even if the opponent is ignoring every smart reason and just says it. I still
Yeah.
hate getting hit. Right. So
I'm right there.
the stringere thing I do is like, if you're here and they're there and you're moving to the side, always, if you're moving from right to left in Porta di Ferro Strada, or Iron Gate as we call it in my club,
Mhm.
you always will be having advantage. You will always be moving in a position whereby you have advantage. So if they attack, you can just put your true edge over their sword and stab them, and they can't stab you back. And so that's basically number one. So I always assume that the people that I fight with are going to be suicidal, because in my club, most people know don't try to parry what I do, because I'll just do something else and else and else and else. They always immediately wait for me to do something and then make a suicidal counterattack, which was
Mhm.
annoying when I first started, but actually really kind of forced me to up my game. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that, I mean, one, I kind of love what you're doing, because it's a thought process that I started to have when I really started. Dogs, man.
What are you gonna do, dude?
Whatever.
What are you gonna do?
It's an informal podcast, so we might as well just let them join the podcast, man.
Fuck it,
I'll
dude.
give
He
them
just
a
wants
drink
to,
too.
he wants to be heard. He wants to be part of the party.
Yeah. So I love what you're doing, because it's something that I was kind of leaning towards a little bit when I was working with Manciolino, and really trying to kind of come up with a better single sword interpretation for Manciolino, because I was like, here are these like 6 techniques, right?
Yep.
And really, in isolation, they're kind of boring, and I wanted to make them a little bit more interesting, right?
Yep.
Whether or not that's the right thing to do, I just wanted to make them more interesting for my own individual practice. And so I started thinking, okay, well, what if I start to take this offline a little bit? What if I make this a little bit of a bigger crossing to make some of these
That's
techniques work
exactly what
better?
it does. It scares the fuck out of people to, I guess I probably
Yeah.
shouldn't drop in so many F-bombs in here.
No,
But
it's okay. It's all right.
It makes
Well,
people really nervous when you're setting their sword aside and your point is going in their face. It makes them react.
yeah, and I think that's kind of when especially like looking at that first anonymous play in your translation, like I get the feeling that that's what makes sense for that. Like otherwise, how is that other person going to end on the other side of your sword, so that way you can hit it with a falso?
Right.
It feels like they're going to have to do something where they're trying to either disengage or react in some way.
Right. That's
Obviously,
actually, I was just filming that earlier today. So what they do, and then how basically where they just change lines without attacking, and then that sets you up to put your false edge over and go on with the main line of the play there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense too, because if they change measure, right? Like if they step back and step out of measure, then that's an opportunity for you to let your sword sort of drift even further to the inside to get to that outside line, so that way you can kind of press that.
right.
It's like, yeah, because even if you have like a crossing, right? So if I come in Porta de Ferro Strata and I
Yep.
get a crossing on your sword, and I'm putting pressure on your sword, and
Yes.
you take a step back, because you don't want to deal with it, and you relieve that pressure, chances are my sword is going to drop down a little bit, and it's going to put me on that outside line, which allows for that false edge coming in and then
Right.
that play to progress. So I don't know. I just feel like I think you're onto something. I like it.
Thanks. Thank you. So
Yeah.
I've tried to boil the beginning of the Anonymous. This is my take on it. And this could be, I basically think the beginning of the Anonymous is an algorithm that describes how you're supposed to fence. So that is the initial action is number one. That gives you the whole main sequence. And then everything else in the Anonymous up until about play number 24 or so is just derivations off of that sequence. So different things they could do. So for example, when you cut into Codalunga Stretta with the left foot forward, Codalunga Alta, right? The
Mhm.
second play in the Anonymous is defending yourself versus an attack to the inside in Codalunga Alta. So I
Mm.
think it's just instead of them doing nothing, which is what the first play assumes, now they're attacking in, and so it describes how you deal with that.
Yeah.
And then number three has you go into Codalunga Stretta, which is the counter for somebody doing stringere to you on the inside. So if
Mm.
somebody's stringering you to the inside, the moment you make the half turn of the hand, you now gain advantage of the guard. And so, and then that then takes you into the Codalunga Stretta sequence.
Yeah. And then like 15 and 16 would essentially be the responses for what would happen if somebody just flat out tried to attack you and you were in Porta de
Yep,
Ferro, right? Because
exactly.
it's all defense. It's pretty much like he basically lays out at- defenses against every conceivable attack and even
Yep,
feints.
right.
So it's like here you've got this entire corpus and framework to just kind of say, hey, this is my strategy going forward, right?
It's
Yeah, I
exactly,
like
and
that.
that everything leads up to that. And so, and same with 9 and 10 is if, so one of the things that can happen then if you get into the outside, and I'm sure this happens to you a lot too, if you're engaged to the outside and you're stepping to the left, well, your opponent can pretty much just step to the left too. So you guys get into that giant, like kind of giant circle
Mhm.
jerk where you're just continually going to the left. That opens up the falso and reverso action, which is in 9 and 10. So if
So
you try to,
let
yeah,
me let me throw some more fuel on the fire here because Chris
okay,
has an interesting way of approaching this where based on like Delagoke, one of the things that we've been doing is working on assuming a guard. So for example, if we want to get to Codalonga Stretta or
uh-huh.
Porta de Ferro Stretta, we would
Yes,
start in Codalonga Alta.
okay,
So or excuse me, we'd start in yeah, and Codalunga Alta. And we'd step forward and essentially do something like a Mezzo Mandrito or something like that in order to get over. And if
yeah.
you think about it, if that's my step, my initial step to get that initial stringere on my opponent's sword, that
Mhm.
actually lines up perfectly with 10 and 11 because that's essentially what you're doing, right? You're kind of beating their sword by going
No, it's a
into Porta de
falso and
Ferro's
reverso. I mean, it's the
as
same
a
kind of
falso and
thing,
reverso. Okay,
right? So
gotcha.
the
That's right. I
problem, this
haven't.
is what I
It's
was
been
trying
a.
to emphasize with the stringere video, and this is going to be coming up
Uh,
more. To stringere, it's very important that your sword doesn't move.
hmm,
Your sword cannot, it's definitely not a beat because if your sword moves and the enemy's sword is not there, it goes away. Your sword is
right.
now moving and you're behind in the defense.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So, I mean, the beat to Iron Gate or to Porta di Ferro Stretta from Alta is totally a legit thing, but it's, I think, kind of a separate thing. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then your falso impuntanto interpretation was pretty cool too. And the interesting thing that about it that I think is, even though conceptually, kind of going in with the flat of the sword feels like a shield howl just a little bit. I feel like the way that you were doing it was a little bit different, where like that's kind of how you get to the falso, but starting on the flat and then turning to the edge was actually a really cool thing that I don't I I really enjoyed it. It challenged what I was thinking a little bit, and I was like, hey, that actually kind of makes sense a little bit because, like, you think about all the different times in the Anonimo where he talks about um, doing the falso impuntanto, and I think there's even one play where he specifically tells you really the best data point of like what the falso impuntanto is, right? And he says that it's essentially just turning your hand up, right? Or it's like the turn of the hand after the cut. And I feel
Okay,
like
I don't
that's
remember that.
if you hit with the flat and then turn to the edge, I feel like that's essentially doing that, right? Like it's that turn of the hand that just like the initial action creates the space, and then the turn of the hands creates the threat of the point going around.
So if you want to think of
And that
like
was
from the
cool, man.
two, okay. So if you for like the two-handed sword, right? And this
Hmm.
is super important because the two-handed sword is so fast. You're always trying to seek the bind to slow shit down, right?
Right.
And that when they come in to make any kind of engagement, they're going to be aligning base to the line that you're on. And then by turning your hand at the last instant, you're now striking to a new line, but they're, to use a German term, they're in the knock, so they don't have time to actually react to the new line that they're going to be on, and that lets you
Yeah.
strike and gain on that new line. So my take is kind of like what you're saying, is that the falso impuntanto is just any time that we're striking and then we turn our hand in the middle of the strike in such a way that we threaten with the point. I don't know if it's solid, but it's the only interpretation I've seen so far that would work against somebody who was determined to attack you suicidally.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's about constraining and about control versus I mean, I think some of the interpretations that I've seen that are just more like a more traditional Shielhau and KDF. Really, I mean, just like a traditional, you got to think like a traditional KDF Shielhau. You're starting probably from Vomtag, you can even be up here.
Yeah,
And it's like you're kind of hitting and turning. So you're kind of coming to the inside line and then turning out, which is, I guess the same. Some people interpret it as just like almost like striking with the flat to get the point in. So even they have some like variation on that sort of thing. But I like the idea of kind of striking and turning, even with single-handed sword, and doing that with like Marazzo's falso impuntanto. I've found in teaching my students that striking like a true mandrito with the edge and then allowing them to react and then turning my hand using
yeah,
feeling, which is another
right.
KDF term, which I just got done railing about using KDF and Bolognese, but whatever. Um, and um, you use your feeling of how much pressure they're giving you to turn your
Yeah,
hand out, and you're going to have your point online, and they're going to have to continue to make that parry. And a lot of times, especially with Marazzo in particular, that's what opens up that leg cut.
that's
It's
what
like it's
opens
like
up the
it's so
cut.
easy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
so
so
easy.
easy.
And anytime it's done to you, I mean, there is nothing. I think when I learned it, it was called an expulsion, where it's basically anytime you have your sword and somebody does the thing that makes that particular noise that the sword makes when the false edge like gently rides
Hmm.
down and the sword just gets scooted out of the way and it ends with their point right in your face.
Yeah.
Yeah. Every time that ever happened to me, I was like, oh, this guy really knows what he's doing, dude.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I used almost exclusively the falso impuntanto one time in a tournament to get to second place in that tournament. I mean,
Nice.
I just
Yeah,
nobody had an answer for it. It's just
right.
constantly just going in,
It's just
boom,
nasty.
boom.
Right. Right. You have to
Yeah,
make an
and then if they
extra
do,
wide parry. Yeah.
yeah, and the first time you hit them, they're just like, oh, what was that? And then they're
Right.
like, then they're really making that extra wide parry, and then that's when you
And then you
start
get
getting the
the
leg cut.
opening for the other stuff.
And then you
Yeah.
get the opening back. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, I can't make a wide parry. So what do you do with that?
The rule I
You know?
found out from Morozzo that I've done for his two-handed sword work is that you never cut around somebody when their point is in front of you. So you always try to make them move their point offline and only then do you cut around. And once I kind of
Yeah.
figured out that rule, it really made everything kind of logical and simple for me.
Yeah. And so I know I've been, my life has been crazy lately. So this will be the second podcast episode that comes out in like 2 weeks. But
I was
the
starting to
one that's
wonder
going to come
about
out
that.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been wild. I'm changing jobs and just going through a lot of stuff, and we've been planning an event. So it's been
Cool.
pretty crazy. But Then the podcast that's going to come out before this will be my episode with Greg Millay. And so we talked about this quite a bit, where we were talking about um shoot, where was I going with that? The what were we just talking about? We were talking about the falso impuntanto. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, the falso impuntanto, like the setup for the falso impuntanto. So I've been, a lot of my railing has been on just kind of not being settled with a lot of things that I've seen in interpretations with the larga plays, right? The wide play actions of
Yeah.
Marazzo. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll be satiated if I go and I look at book 2 and book 3 of Marazzo and really start digging into that and seeing if there's something in there that kind of helps this for me, right? And so I was looking at book 3 and I was looking at his advice for what he does with the Guardia di Testa, right? And one of the
Yep.
things he tells you about Guardia di Testa is that Guardia di Testa is good for attacking somebody who's in Guardia di Testa, coda longa stretta, coda longa alta, and that's it. It's not good for attacking somebody who's in Porta de Ferro alta, right? Or and that's what your opponent is in that first larga play of
Right.
Marazzo and book 1, right? So essentially they're in a disadvantageous guard for you as you're coming in, and you're feinting to get them out of that guard, because just like what you said, their point is online and you have to work to get their point offline, right? Which goes back to the Anonymous advice. And
Right. Which is
so you do
yeah.
that feint. Yeah. And so you do that feint in order to get it off, so that way you can deliver the Stramazzoni.
So that's the problem I've had with I've tried the other interpretations that are out there for that opening action,
Hmm.
and every time I tried that, my guys just stabbed me in the hand.
Mm.
Like, because that's how we kind of train. Like, if you can stab somebody in the hand, your primary target anytime your point is in line and their hand is offline, like yours should be going for the hands. And I couldn't do it without them being unable to stab me in the hand. So yeah, I'm not really wedded to my falso impuntanto interpretation, but what I did want to do is I wanted to get it out there in the hopes that somebody would, you know, try to come up with a better one, and then we could get the better one, because I don't like being the ugly stepchild of the HEMA world. I really think that the people who do Fiore and the Germans are inferior to us, but we don't have the
Well,
cachet that they do.
well,
So
that's because we're still in our infantile stages, and
exactly.
it's hard for people to sort of like conceptualize that now, especially because we're getting so much information. But
Exactly.
think, I mean, like, we just got all of the known treatises translated and out to us, you know?
Right. Yeah, when I think about the fact that like one of them was done by some dude in California that didn't actually speak Italian, that kind of tells me everything you need to know about the Bolognese treatises, dude.
Well,
Like, I guess they were in need of somebody to come along.
hey, speaking of, have you had an opportunity to look at Swinger's new translation or
I have not.
of
No, I'm supposed
Manciolino?
to be getting a copy, but I haven't got it yet. I'm
It's
super
so good.
stoked about it.
It's so
Dude,
good.
dude, I'm telling you, Jarek is a freaking amazing translator, man. I mean, I
So
learned so much by working with that dude. That, yeah, I have no doubt that it's freaking amazing.
it is. One of the things that I love about it is, I think for sake of brevity, just the way that Tom Leone laid out his, which was a long time ago and a different world. Like,
Exactly. It was like, get people doing this stuff, period. Whoa, lost you.
hey, there you are.
Okay, cool.
All right. What was the last thing you heard?
You were talking about Tom's translation.
Okay, yeah. So for Tom Leone's translation, it was published in what, like the early 2000s,
2010, I want to say.
2010. So it's
Mhm.
it's about 11 years old, And even 10 years ago, especially for like the Bolognese system, that was like the only Bolognese translated treatise that was readily available.
Yeah.
And it was like the Wild West.
Right.
A lot of the stuff hadn't been settled and understood. But I think for the sake of brevity, he left out a lot of the details that are present in Swinger's translation, and it makes it so much more fun to read. Like
I mean, yeah.
I was reading through some of the sections that I've studied, like two swords, sword and large buckler, single-handed sword, really book 4. And I got to the two sword section, and he's got this one part where he's like, in the Leone translation, he tells you to cut a fendente, right? But Manciolino actually tells you to cut a fendente that ruins his face. And I was like, yeah.
Right. Oh, how could you miss that? Yeah. Right.
I was like, why wasn't this there before? It makes him sound like it. Honestly, I'm going to say this really quiet. It sounds like the Anonymous a little bit.
It totally does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so weird, right? Because it's kind of weird. Like I came into HEMA in 2015, which I think that's about when you got into it too, right?
Yep.
So we kind of came in when there was already, I mean, there was Wichtenauer and there was translations, but maybe not everything was translated, but the pattern had kind of been laid out, by people who had come before. So it's interesting kind of imagining and hearing about what it was like 10 years before we started, like really like the wild, wild west, basically. Like nobody knows what they're doing. And
yeah.
Except for the rapier people, because I guess that, I think the rapier stuff is pretty well written and translates pretty well from modern fencing. That's the impression I
Yeah,
have.
for sure. And, for the Bolognese system in particular, like, I remember when I first got my hands on Marozzo, and, Marozzo was the third treatise that we really got. And the thing about Della
Yeah.
Gocche is Della Gocche, even in his own right, is parsing down the Bolognese system to fit the fencing of his time. And he admits that in his introduction. He says that fencing of the ancients was used a lot of wide play, and wide play was beautiful, but I'm primarily focused on like narrow play actions and stuff like that.
Right.
And that's really what he presents. I mean, he almost boils the Bolognese system down to 5 guards, just like the Roman system with 4 guards. So when you think about it, it's like Della Gocche is even sort of like parsing out some of the bigger details of the Bolognese system. So really, we didn't really get a view of like the earlier Bolognese stuff until we got our hands on Marozzo. And then it was like, I mean, you remember the discussions. It was crazy. It was like, what is a falso puntanto? Like
Dude,
this
we're
thing.
still wondering that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but now we have more context, right? Because now we have the Anonimo, who actually has some like interesting discussion on the falso puntanto, and
we
we've got
have
data.
more people with more points of view. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And,
So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, like some of the frog DNA that I think we pulled in from like the earlier days, which I think a lot of people who are sort of settled in their interpretations, which, maybe they shouldn't be settled, but, perhaps some people are settled in their interpretations. They're kind of sticking to this idea that we still need that frog DNA. Whereas I'm starting to get the feeling that we've got enough of the corpus where we can really start just looking at the Bolognese system to understand it.
Yeah. Like we can really become just truly Bolognese. We shouldn't say not frog DNA though, because it's like,
well, yeah,
we've learned things from like the KDA. Like if I had never done Meyer, I would have never known about the Schielhau. And I wouldn't say that the falso impotanto is a Schielhau per se, but it's the basic idea of getting your sword in there and slinging it in such a way that their point ends up your point ends up in their face.
Yeah. Well, it's a process of sanctification, right? To use a church term here. It's like you generally have like a broader understanding at the beginning, and then you start to develop a higher level of understanding that sort of solidifies your understanding of more core concepts of the overall system, and that's what makes it more interesting.
No,
so
totally. Yeah. So that's I think we are reaching that point now. We can start turning it into like a legitimate martial art, I guess you'd say, like something that really kind of can stand shoulder to shoulder with the more developed HEMA schools.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're kind of well on our way to
Yeah.
getting there. I think we're really starting to develop in that direction. I mean, I've seen so many people start to really kind of like focus on the Bolognese system, and how many side swords are there available now? It used to be
Right.
you couldn't find a HEMA trainer that was a side sword. Now they're
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
I'm
And
just
now
like,
it's,
wow,
yeah.
these guys are making side swords.
The thing is, you could say about Bolognese is rarely does somebody ever start doing Bolognese and then go back to KDF or go back to something else.
That's
Usually,
true.
everybody once they understand some Bolognese, that's everything that they want to do.
So the other thing that was in there, I posted this on Facebook, but I thought this is so funny. So Jarek found he went through a library and he found this account of court records from Bologna, and it was dated to like 1820 or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but either way, one of the accounts in there of this like court case was from 1571, right? So right at the time of
Delagoke
Delagoke,
time. Yeah.
and it's this crazy street brawl that ends up happening where these guys are like chasing each other around town with like spiedos and stuff
Nice.
and like carrying around like two-handed swords. But there's this one account where this guy's like they're kind of like interviewing this one witness, and he's like, they're like, did you see this one guy? And he's like, we found Mr. Lognani with the bare greatsword in his hand, or maybe it was a half sword. I don't know how to tell the difference. And I was like, oh man, like wait a second, that's literally like the entire HEMA universe right now. Like how
Oh
many
my
times have you
God.
heard that discussion? How many
Right.
times?
It's like the parallel between the fencing masters all criticizing each other in their art, like and how people do it now. It's
Yeah,
as it was, so it shall be again 500 years later. Oh
that's
my
right.
God. That's
Absolutely, man.
awesome.
It's perfect. It's like, oh,
Oh, yeah.
if somebody couldn't figure out the difference between a hand and a half sword and a great sword in 1570, then
Man,
you
we're
know,
in the clear. We're in the clear.
yeah, I'm good. Yeah, so it's I
Yeah,
got such a
so
kick out.
I was supposed to get a free copy of it, but then that's not working out, so I'll probably just order it and pay for it.
Yeah,
I thought
that's
I'd
all right.
already done that, but then I guess I didn't. And, it's been a confused mess right now.
Yeah, that's all right. There's some good stuff in there. I need to do more of a side by side comparison to figure out some of the differences because of the added language. I think that there's some instances where and I can't confirm this because again I haven't really tried to parse it out, but there are some techniques where it seems like he used the word beat instead of cut, which like Leone used the word cut, and
Yeah.
then Swinger used beat. So that's a big difference. The difference between a beat and a cut kind of changes how you view these things and whether or not you're the overall technique. Like, are you kind of leaning with a beat or are you leaning with a cut? I
It's
mean,
kind of
it's a big
important.
deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I
So
get, yeah, that's what's tough about translating is, like trying to figure out, knowing that people who don't have that language ability are going to be making conclusions based on how you translate stuff and trying to capture that ambiguity um, in a way that's useful. So that it's tough, man. Yeah.
yeah, and I,
So
I don't want to discredit Tom Leone translation and by any means. Like,
yeah,
I'm not saying that Swingers is like in any way superior. I just think it's interesting that like because I understand the importance of what Tom Leone did at the time that he did. Because reading the language of the Bolognese system when Tom Leone was translating that was way different than what we're doing now. Like you've got, when Tom was doing that, there were probably like maybe like 30 or 40 people who are really proficient in the Bolognese system, you
in
know,
the world, in
and
the world,
and
yeah,
could actually like, yeah, exactly,
right,
who could actually read through those treatises and get an idea of what was happening if he would have left the language relatively similar to the way it was, you know. But
yeah,
now you've probably got a few thousand who can do that, and
right,
so like having that translation out for those people is more rewarding for those people, where for Tom it was, how can I spread the Bolognese system to more people and make this more accessible for everybody else. And I think he
Right.
succeeded in doing that.
Absolutely. And
So
kind of like laid the foundation for where we are now. Like I think that was a very important work in
yeah,
terms of
yeah, yeah,
developing the Bolognese community. And but now we're also at a point where we can do
yeah,
things that are more advanced. Like I found it. So when I was working through the Assalti, I found it necessary to actually go back to the Italian in order to really make some stuff work out. But like I never would have actually gotten to
hmm
where I was looking to the Italian if I hadn't started with Leone's book and been going through it. Right. So that's kind of
yeah,
I think the nature of any time you're the first to do something.
yeah, for sure. And that's why it's seminal and it's important and it should be celebrated. And I mean, it's still a great piece of work for, like, if I had to point a beginner to Mancilino, I'd probably point them to Leone first,
Got it.
and then say, okay, then go look at,
Yeah.
like,
Just don't
look
point
at
them to
Swinger's
Daligoke
translation,
because
and then
Daligoke is a waste of time.
oh man, your hatred for Dalagoke it cracks me up. Let's talk smack about Dalagoke for a little bit. Tell me some more reasons why you hate him.
All right. First of all, he covers 3 weapons, right? That's boring in and of itself, right? That's very
Yeah.
underwhelming for a Bolognese author. Also, he streamlines the system in a
Yep.
way
Yep.
that's sort of soulless. But I think here's the thing that really sucks about Daligoke compared to the other ones. He doesn't string attacks along. So if you look at an attack at the Anonymous, it's like you do this, they do this. It's like you can see the progression of how you go through the sequence. And in Daligoke, it's just you do this and respond, and that's the end of the story. You know what I mean? And watching people who are
Yeah.
Daligoke fighters, they do a thing and then they stop, and then like that's the end of the game. And then they like pause and reset, and there's no flow. Um, Also, I
Yeah.
think he's just
Yeah.
kind of dull. So I don't know. What about you? What's your take on Daligoke?
Hmm. Um. Okay. So my perspective on this whole thing has changed a little bit.
Okay.
So when I talked to Dario, he brought up something that I thought was really interesting because he asked a question that I've been wrestling with ever since I talked
Ooh.
to him, right?
Okay.
So he
Sounds
was
good.
talking about um I I brought up Marazzo's progression through the guards, like why he puts all of his section where he's like learn all of the cuts and thrusts and defenses and counters um, to the attacks from all the different guards, and then lays it out in that big block in the middle of his book
Mhm.
2,
Right.
right. So why does he put that in the middle? And so Dario's assumption as to why the Bolognese masters do this is because he says that you should learn the flow and the plays first and how to just kind of progress through fencing. And then you should go back and study the guards and how to break the guards and like the overall idea
Right. You
of
don't want
how
to
to
get
attack the
mentally
guards.
stuck in the idea of guards and more think of them as a position through which you pass. Right.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's like you learn how to move and you learn how to like essentially move in dynamic ways and parry in dynamic ways and go through all these actions and things like that. And then you come back and then you really learn the core tactical framework. And so um, if you look at Marazzo and you look at the Anonimo, they're laid out the same way because what is it? Plays like 360 through 400 of the Anonimo, like that last section where he gives just the you're in matching guards. So
Yes. The Daligoke section.
yeah, exactly, the Dalgoke section.
Yeah.
Yep. So why does he put that at the very end? And maybe that's why he puts it at the very end. Maybe it's because you've already gone through and you've already learned all these different things and these sort of ways that you can progress through the plays. And then it's like, okay, now let's really kind of learn how to think about like that initial, like I've come into measure, how am I breaking this?
So the one thing to look at with those is try to figure out what the measure is on those Daligoke plays. So I believe that the reason why they're kind of in that separate one is you're in stretta guards and you're close enough that you're striking their hand without having to step, or you're thrusting with just a short step, so it's very close. And I suspect that that's part of the reason why it's at the end of the single sword section, because it's basically you're now so good that you can get that close to somebody and be able to defend yourself. But that's also, like you're saying,
Gotcha.
kind
So
of
you
like
see those
you've
more.
already mastered the flow.
I got you. So that would be more like with Delagokie, where he gives your what does he do? Like true edge to true edge, false edge to false edge kind of plays
I
that he
guess. I mean,
gives
I'm
after
not.
his
Yeah,
provocations.
I'm not so sure on Dalagokie's layout, but I know that's at the end. But if you look at those, the measure seems to be incredibly tight. I mean, anytime that you can hit somebody's hand, anytime you can strike any part of another fencer without stepping, then you're basically acting. You have to act time of the hand, so everything's really, really fast, right? So, and I don't
Right.
believe he has anywhere you have to
Yeah.
step in order to strike somebody's hand or sword. So you're crossed on their sword, but it's probably like, kind of
Yeah.
like you're saying, like you've already learned the flow that kind of gets you to these positions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like to take Palladini's term, the misura di ferere, which is like the measure of striking, and you're kind of in that place where like you've already stepped through like the edge of measure, and you're kind of just in a place where you can go ahead and start hitting them.
And it
Yeah.
means that they now have to, or more specifically, if you're the defender, you now have to act instantaneously, right? There's no time to
Right.
pause. Anytime you're in that kind of measure where somebody can strike you without having to step, you have to go. You have to react instantly to whatever they do. There's no time to observe. So that's why
Yeah.
I think that section's really interesting.
Huh.
So what I think is really interesting too is
Yeah,
you
yeah.
take that
No, I
section and then you look through the anonymo beforehand, and you can find those different attacks and then variations on those attacks in different plays in the anonymo.
yeah. So I that's what I've been trying to go through and really look at every different author's approach to attacking from specific guards, and then the defense from the guards, I'll get there eventually, but just like initiating attacks from certain guards to see if there are trends and general ideas to pull out, like, are there more data points for what a specific guard is really good for? Like, is there an attack that they prefer from a specific guard that we can say this is probably a good way to go? So, for example, like I took all of Manciolino's attacks with his sword and small buckler at the beginning of his like his first chapter, right, where he's
Okay.
teaching the attacks. And I was looking at Codalonga Alta and Porta de Ferro Stretta. And with Codalonga Alta, he really only has two ways to initiate his attacks, right? Like there's a lot to those different sequences based on how
But the
your opponent
thruster
reacts,
falls into the hand.
but
Yeah.
you really only have exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it's two basic actions, right? So you know that when you're in Codalonga Alta, these two basic actions are really kind of the things that you can work
There's
with to
one
sort of
more that's
progress
really
through
important.
as a provocation and attack.
There's one more that's actually really useful and important.
The
The fendente to the head.
the changing step with the yeah, yeah, yeah.
So if you're here in Codalunga Alta, I was just fencing earlier today in sword and small buckler, and that fendente to the head is also really important from Alta. So I forget which one.
Yeah,
It's
and
like
I
the
like that one
fifth
too because
provocation or something.
it is, yeah, and it's accompanied with that changing step, right? So it's like you kind of almost make them assume that you're gonna step out of measure or something like that by gathering that your left foot back, and then step forward with the right foot to throw the fendente.
Does he do that on? Hold on, I got my man right here. He does that on a changing step.
Yeah.
Oops.
I wasn't gonna post video of this, but with the books falling behind you, I think I am gonna post video.
Dude, yeah, my life is kind of a hot mess. Let's see here. Yes, it is. It is with the changing step. Ooh, that's great. So then the best way to do it, if you pull in, that will draw them in, and then as they come in, that's the best time to hit them with the fendente. Ooh, very nice. Okay.
Yep.
I wasn't doing it
And
that way,
then
but I'm gonna do that.
my
that way in the
favorite part
future.
about yeah, and the cool thing is so if they keep their hands low in the parry, then it's super effective. You're gonna hit them like every time. But if they put their hands high, then chances are they're going to be able to parry it and turn it off to the side. But it sets up one of the Anonymous like favorite things, which is to press into their arm and then cut that sideways tondo into the side of the head.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I was like, oh man, this is perfect. You set it
yeah.
up with that fendente, then they start to their hands go high, and you're just like pop pop.
Yep. I mean,
And I
anytime
love
the
it.
hands go high, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, sure, we'll go for the arms instead. That's fine. I like that if you can get over and then you
Yeah.
the fendente, and then you can turn the thrust, like in the second Mancellino, second assault, we do the fendente, and then you do the turn of the body and you wind that thrust in there. That one's kind of my favorite action to pull off personally. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, Mancellino,
And that's
I
kind
love
of
the Anonymous,
a
but
false.
Mancellino probably has the more like awesome stuff in his, like more awesome, fun fencer stuff of all of the sources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've spent the last probably I had ignored Mancellino for a long time. And because I was primarily working with Marazzo, again, kind of going back to our roots by looking at Ilka and stuff like that, the
Yeah.
two sources that I kind of really focused on early on were Delagoche and Marazzo. Um, and and then I finally got a copy of Mancellino, and ever since I haven't left. Like Mancellino has just like dominated so much of my study.
He's
It's just
so
like
much
I'm
fun,
having a
man.
great time with it.
Yeah, it's like Morozo's
Yeah,
Morozo lays
it,
out a very logical foundation, but if you just want to hit people or you just want to do assaultes and just have fun, Mancellino's totally where it's at. This is why I don't like Dolagoki. He's like literally none of the advantages. Morozo gives you, like a good foundation across different weapons. Dolagoki has simple advantages that is easily understandable. That's all he's got going for him.
yeah. And now that our fendentes are going to ruin somebody's face, it's going to make it so much more fun. Because we're getting all of the parts that were just like yeah, you're just like, oh man, oh yeah, I can see that. Like I'm visualizing everything I'm reading. I'm just like, ooh.
So it'll be one of those shots, those ones
it's like when Marazzo tells you.
Yeah, what'd you say?
Oh, I was gonna say it's like when Marazzo tells you to cut from their head down to their toes. Oh, I think we got a delay. Sorry.
Okay. I was thinking it was gonna be like, when you're fencing and somebody gets you with a good one and it smells like gunpowder. That's gonna be a total gunpowder.
Oh yeah.
Cut. They're gonna be sniffing gunpowder
Absolutely
after that.
Yeah. maybe we can work on a modern treatise and just make sure that they smell the gunpowder.
That's right, because the fendente is the one you don't ever have to pull back, right? Like so you can't ever hit people hard with a tondo because that's like concussable because it moves their head this way. But fendentes always moves in the direction of their spine, so you don't have to worry about hurting them that way. You just come straight down onto the mask as hard as you want, and they're fine. So those are always fun.
That's right. Yep.
It doesn't take long after doing this before your primary concern becomes protecting your fencing partner.
For sure. Yeah. That's that was actually, you brought up a good point. That was actually something I had to really kind of teach with that counter, with that tondo to the side of the head. I was telling my students, I was like, this is the way that you're going to knock somebody out. So be very careful, as you're going for this tondo to the side of the head, because it is probably, one, you're attacking a weak spot in the mask. Two, you're more likely to hit them in the back of the head. Three, like you said, you're going against the direction of the spine, so you're not hitting into their structure, you're hitting away from their structure and where they're weakest. It's kind of like the strong and the weak of a sword, right? Like, I mean,
It totally
if your
is.
sword is it
Yeah.
crossed this way,
Right. Yeah, it's totally
you
the
know, it's
same
like
thing.
the side of the head is the flat of the sword. Yeah,
That's right. You always want to hit
yeah,
them in the
that's
strong
awesome.
of the head. Stay away from the flat of the head. Yeah, so that's what I do for new people too. Is we'll be like, we'll
Nice.
calibrate our blows, and then be like, okay, so if you're cutting straight down, this is how hard you can hit, and they'll be like, wait, I can hit harder than that, and I can hit harder than that, and then we get to the side ones, and I'm like, nope, can't hit that hard, can't hit that hard, and then dial it back. So, yeah,
Yeah, that's good. That's good
weird things
stuff,
you
man.
learn from experience, right?
So, well, yeah, good and bad, right?
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how's the Bolognese event coming along?
Yeah, so
Do you
it's
think?
coming along really well. So we've got the dates down, we got the location down. So it's going to be 3 full days of programming. We are going to be probably looking at teachers this week, next week, something like that. There's going to be 2 tracks. So track number 1 is going to be oriented more for people who are unfamiliar with the Bolognese system. And that's going to be unlocking Bolognese swordsmanship. So it's going to be, basically getting your body to do what the sources want you to do, getting your mind to understand tempi, really laying the foundations. And then the other one is the other track is going to be from page to application, and that's where we're going to be looking at how to turn all the stuff that we have going on in the books and bring that into modern fencing practice, right? So, how exactly do we make this a living martial art? Yeah, so that's kind of what we're going
Yeah,
and
that sounds
what we got
awesome.
going. Yeah, I'm super excited about it. Ever since the one in 2018, I've really been dying for another Bolognese event because in order for us, I think, to really, really reach that next level as a group, we need to get together in person and share the stuff that we've got going, and try it out. And
Yeah.
hopefully all the best ideas will kind of float to the top, and that's what we can be working from. um, yeah, so that's kind of what we got going on for the event, man.
Cool. Cool. Are you still going to do it in Vancouver?
Yeah, it's going to be at Academy Duello in Vancouver. And yeah, it's going to be 3 full days. I think we're going to try to arrange some sort of billeting options for people that are coming in from out of town. Yeah, at this point where we're at now is we're going to be looking at trying to nail down exactly who wants to come out to teach and what they're going to teach, that sort of thing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm looking forward to it, man. I'm super excited about coming out there and doing that.
Oh man, I'm so glad. It'd be fun. We can actually fence in person. I'm looking forward to it.
I know.
Yeah.
We'll do a little bit
Yeah.
of Manciliano small sword and buckler.
That's right. Oh, it's so much fun, dude. I love that. It's the small sword and buckler is the best. Yeah. I mean, it is a shame that you weren't able to come to that last one, but hopefully we'll start having these on a kind of semi-regular basis, and then all the people who are really into Bolognese can get together and we can practice, man. Really raise ourselves up. Yeah.
We've
So
got,
tell me about.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So
What
tell
were
me
you gonna
about
say?
your event. I know you were wanting to talk about that too.
Yeah. So we've got Oktoberfest coming up. So every year, Triangle Sword Guild does Oktoberfest, which is like a big camping event. And so we've got like cabins, and then we have camping, whatever people want to do. But this year we decided to kind of turn it into like this big HEMA party to celebrate HEMA being back. So we're gonna have all sorts of crazy fencing games that we've devised, like a Franco-Belgian beer battle, which is Franco-Belgian rules, but with pints of beer.
With drinking. Yeah, of course.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Awesome.
So we've got all these crazy games that we've devised, and so Friday night will be a lot of fun, and then we've got we've got somebody coming in that's going to teach dance, and they're going to teach us like a period dance that also helps to inform footwork and sword fighting.
Yeah, that's I think totally the new frontier of HEMA, man.
Absolutely.
Is dance. We need to get some people who are like legit dance people to start raising our footwork, because we
Yeah.
need to get better footwork, and the footwork that these people knew in the past was based on dance.
I mean, Eric Weiss said that we should all be doing Cuban dancing. So maybe maybe there's just a lot of Cuban dancing on the horizon for all of us. I don't know.
I think we need dancing, man. I really think that's got to be the new frontier, because like I see the footwork stuff people are doing, and it's just I mean, the sources tell us like dance is where you learn to step, man.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well,
that's awesome that you guys are gonna have that.
Yeah. So I'm going to go off on a tangent here on an aside, because I think this is actually kind of important. So I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and we were talking about why dance is significant. And I was trying to explain it to him. He's not a HEMA practitioner at all. And what's really interesting is if you look at, Jess Finley has done a lot of work with the KDF system, talking about how a lot of the language that's used in the KDF system is all based around hunting, right?
Mhm.
And that's true even of the Bolognese system. There are certain elements of the Bolognese system, like cinghiale, for example, like the boar's tooth. I
Sure.
mean, it makes sense that that would be sort of the idea of a hunting term, but there might be some level of terminology that we're missing for maybe like tornere, or like turns of the body, or things like that, that would have been common language in something that everybody would have understood, like dance, that we don't understand because we don't understand period dance.
So I mean, I think it goes even deeper than that. All right. So this is
Okay.
kind of my take. All right. So basically, this is my operative theory. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, people danced like a bunch, and dudes learned
Hmm.
to dance to woo ladies. Like that's kind of what impressed the ladies, was having good dance moves. And I'd say a pretty fair thrust of civilization is dudes finding ways to woo chicks. I mean, that's where a
Yeah.
lot of it comes. And then with the Industrial Revolution, it became a lot more about wealth, and like becoming much more about being productive and having money and stuff like that. And then it became unmanly to dance, right? But there's
Hmm.
this great little quip in oh my god, the Sprezzatura guy. What's his name? It escapes me. Book of the Courtier. Oh, Castiglione. Okay,
Hmm.
so Castiglione has this like funny little anecdote about this knight who had joined the company in the court, and they were now off to do their dancing, and he's like, he kind of stood in the corner with his arms crossed and was like, I don't dance, I fight, right? And they all just laughed at him because it was so against like their culture. I think the lady, I swear to god, I think her quote was something like, well, we better cover you in grease and then we'll put you in the cupboard until the next battle comes out. So like it was very much like part of a dude's life was having some good dance moves, and I think it somehow became
Yeah.
unmanly to dance, and that we need to change that, because I think in order to actually get to the fencing and be able to move the way they did, we need to be able to get our boogie down.
Yeah. It's the Protestants' fault. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's pretty much always the
let's be frank.
Protestants' fault. Yeah.
The Anabaptists ruined it for everybody. They're the ones who in the United States pushed west. They're the ones who were big on just going
The
out there, and
ultimate
they just ruined
killjoys.
it.
Yes, you're not working.
Yeah.
Why are you not working? Yes, that's true. You got to give the Catholics that, man. They knew how to have some fun. I mean, it was, when you get
Yeah.
forgiven for everything whenever you want, you got the right
Oh, you just
mentality.
that's right. You just have to whisper the confession, and everything is good.
That's
Well,
right. An
so
hour a week, you have
well,
to face your misdeeds, and then the rest of the time, you just do what you want.
Exactly. So this is another interesting thing about this conversation that I was having with this guy, in that, you think about most of so I okay, now I remember. So the core of this conversation came from what fencing terms exist in modern language. And I know this is something that Devin Borman's really big on. Um, and like you think about things like, I know he's got a pet theory that prepared is pre-parried, and you're essentially pre-parrying the
I think that's
proposition of
actually a
what
joke.
somebody.
I'm pretty sure he said that as a joke.
Is that a joke?
It's a
Well,
brilliant joke. I'm
okay,
pretty
all right.
sure it's
Well,
a
all right.
joke.
Maybe it was a joke, but there are some words like you think about, like what are your fortes? Like
Right.
what are your strengths? Right? Like,
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yes.
a lot of terms exist
From
from
fencing.
fencing, or have
Yes.
transcended from fencing, but most
Right.
of the time, the fencing terms that have transcended into modern language are from Italian and French, right?
Yes. Okay, sure.
Right. Now, in the German language, there aren't a lot of sword fighting terms that transcended into the German language, which is a low context culture. Whereas French and Italian are both, or excuse me, yeah, it's a high context culture. Whereas French and Italian are low context cultures, right?
What is a
And so,
context culture?
so context culture essentially is how many words will they say in order to get a point across? That's the best way that I can summarize it, right? So a German will probably give you like 3 words to explain something, right? Or
Okay.
to express their feelings, right?
Right.
Whereas an Italian, Spanish, or a French person will probably give you 100 words and will go on a tirade and use their hands and gesture and like really
Got
kind
it.
of
Okay.
that's a low context culture. So low context is in they put less context in their individual words and will use more words to explain an idea, versus a high context culture which will use more compound words to express a single idea.
So is the idea more that somebody is speaking and that they assume that you understand the context of the moment and that they just make a statement that takes that, assuming that you understand the context into account, whereas somebody basically otherwise is explaining the entire context and the whole situation to you? Is that the idea?
Similar, yeah.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it's a term that's used a lot of times in sociology to kind of
Okay.
describe the difference in languages. So, like the Romance languages oftentimes are low context in terms of that they're like a lot of times things that are more important in low context cultures are dialogue, for example. So, like in Italian culture, dialogue is incredibly important. When you have dinner, you sit down for 6 hours. Like if you have family over and there are people there, you're going to sit down for a long time and you're going to sit at dinner for forever, right? Whereas in British culture or in German culture, you're probably going to separate in some way, and so you might have like the gentleman go off and smoke a cigar or something like that, and they might continue to engage in conversation, but the general like overall sort of conge- uh, uh, overall atmosphere of like coming together is sort of separated and broken, right? And so then
Got
it
Okay.
becomes, yeah. So
Cool.
either way, but the Germans in particular, with their sort of real emphasis on using hunting terminology, kind of makes sense in that context of them really kind of just saying like condensing ideas down into something that just transits everything, right? Um, and even with like vor and knock and indes, like before, after, in the moment, um, the names of the guards themselves, like the way that they're described, literally describing the things that they're doing. um, I just find it really fascinating, but that kind of goes into a little bit, but what I was trying to say though with understanding dance and how it could even relate even deeper into some of the fighting systems that we study, is that I wonder if there are like hidden contexts in there, that we're missing, that we just haven't quite explored
I
yet.
think that, yeah, I mean, it seems like there would have to be. And there's got to be
Yeah.
nuances of like movement and stuff like that that we're just not getting because we don't, we spend so much of our time sitting on our behinds and so little of our time actually moving on our feet and seeing what they can do. And when we do, it's usually in prescribed like efficient movement, right? Dance is by its nature not efficient. You're not moving in the way that's most locomotively efficient. You're moving in very different kind of ways, which seems like
Mhm.
sword fighting movement is very much based on not moving in a way that is locomotively efficient, but moving in a way that will keep you from getting stabbed.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 definitely. So, long story short, we're gonna have a dance instructor, and
That's
then
awesome, dude. I'm so
we.
happy that you're having a dance instructor. That was quite an aside and tangent we went off on there, but yeah.
I told you, man. So then, on Saturday, we're going to have this big block of lectures, and we've got some really great instructors coming out. Eric Lowe's going to come out and teach some cutting. He's won, countless tournaments in cutting, and he's going to teach basic mechanics for cutting. And then David Biggs is going to come out. He's going to teach this really cool class. Hopefully, he doesn't mind me saying this, but he's working on something. We've had a lot of conversations about this, but he's working on putting together a class that's going to take the Bolognese system and condense it down into a format so it's similar to the Vienna Anonymous. So the way that the Vienna Anonymous kind of collates and brings together like all the different rapier masters and kind of condenses them into one ideology from the perspective of a student, he's going to do the same thing with various Bolognese masters and teach a class
Cool.
that way.
That sounds
Yeah,
like
so
good.
yeah, it's going to be pretty cool. And then we're going to have a bunch of armor stuff, and we're still working on getting a few announcements for instructors and stuff, but we're I don't know. I think it's going to be pretty cool. So we're going to have a melee, and we're going to reenact a judicial duel, and then we're going to have a secret tournament. It's
That sounds like a lot of
very,
fun, man.
very hush hush. Yeah,
And it's in North Carolina,
it
I
is. Yep.
assume?
Yes, it is.
Cool.
Yeah. So should be fun, man. Should be
Yeah,
fun.
that sounds like a lot of fun. It's great that all this stuff is coming back and that we can get together in person again, isn't it?
Oh, I know. I know. My biggest fear is that everything's going to kind of close back down, but
Yeah.
we'll see. Hopefully we'll
I'm
keep our fingers crossed that things go well and, people are reasonable. So.
Yeah, it sounds like so there's one guy I was hoping that would be able to come from Australia, but I guess they're on total international lockdown there. So
Oh yeah, yeah. Things are pretty rough down there, man.
I guess, yeah, it seems, well, I guess I'm not going to go off on a tangent about what it seems like in Australia, but suffice it to say that that's disappointing to me.
It is, yeah, it is. Well, I mean,
But
even
yeah,
I, I'm kind of worried that even Canada has been, very uh, international travel has been difficult with Canada through the last
yeah,
preceding
yeah.
months, and I'm hoping that things do ease up so that way it'll make it easier in February when we come
It
out to do the Bolognese event.
should be. I think it's highly inconvenient to them to be locked down from the United States because there's so much cross border connection between the two countries, whereas like Australia is just its own little island, right?
Yeah, yeah, and you have to sit on an airplane for like 16 hours with somebody
Right.
if you want to get to the United
Right,
States.
exactly.
It's not like you can just drive across the border or
Right.
take
I
like
think
a
Australians are
6-hour
probably
plane.
born learning how to like sit on airplanes patiently.
Seriously, yeah.
They must
Yeah.
be, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, well, you want me to sit on a 16-hour flight to go somewhere? There better be something amazing when I land. Oh man, that's too awesome. But yeah, that's it's great that it's all coming back, and right now the future just looks pretty good for all this stuff. So hopefully we'll keep this coronavirus stuff tamped down, and we'll just have more and more. And I don't know. I mean, I kind of think the time was useful though too, because I think it gave people more time to actually think about their swords.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my big takeaway from it was I developed good habits, good training habits. I was training with a sword in hand for, at least anywhere between an hour or 2 hours every day.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, I mean, so much of it was just refining the forms that I already knew. And the
Yeah.
other parts of it was learning new things and exploring different areas and falling in love with Manciolino. So
Manciolino is easy to fall in love with.
yeah.
That was my first text, so that was kind of my introduction to the whole thing. And his assaulti are definitely probably the best thing in Bolognese swordsmanship. The three sword and buckler salty,
Hmm.
those are absolutely wonderful.
How are his strata techniques? I've been meaning to kind of get into his strata stuff. I was looking at Marazzo's, but some of it's kind of crazy. Like he's like, throw your sword over their shoulder and then go in and like put them in a fireman's carry and drop them on their head.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's I've well, so Maroto's ones, if you're not willing to kick your fencing partner in the balls, like you immediately kind of lose some of what you can do, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
so Menchelinos, I think they're super basic. I mean, it's so the most basic one to me is I think it's the first one where literally you just bind to the inside, and then all you have to do is your right foot forward, you bind to the inside, and you just step with your left foot towards their right side and come back and pop them in the face. I mean that's just such a bread and butter action. It takes away why you would need to do almost anything else with the true edge strette, which is
Hmm.
disappointing because they're really fun. But I mean, that one is just so simple, right?
Yeah.
And,
That's
you know,
interesting because he does that with sword and large buckler too. That's one of his defenses.
is boom and then just back.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So you step in like from Codalonga Alta, you step in, and so he does it twice. So the first one is when your opponent just leads with a thrust, and you step in, you step across, and you sort of bind their sword across, and then slice back across with a reverso. And then when they do a thrust and then a mandrito, it's one of his later techniques, and he tells you to step this time, step with your right foot across your left foot. So he says step with
okay,
your right to your left or to your
right.
opponent's right, and then to essentially cut off their ability to ever cut a mandrito, and then slice that reverso back across their face.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty signature Bolognese move. Is I mean, I just kind of explained it as like your goal is always to put your sword between their sword and their body, and then
Hmm.
once your sword is between their sword and their body, they're pretty screwed,
Yeah,
right? That's a
yeah,
shitty situation to get yourself into, and that's just a classic situation. You're there, and it's kind of like, can I stab them? No, because to stab you have to come like way the fuck back, and then to bring the point back. So, but if that's the case, then just come back with the edge, and boom, it's right in their face.
yeah, yeah. And that's so it's like so Manciolino too, though, because like he does the same thing when
Yeah,
he does a falso. It's like cut a falso and then immediately cut a mandrito back across their arms and their
yeah,
chest.
I'm pretty sure
He
that's what the
loves.
Elsa e Tira is. So I've seen some people think the Elsa and Tira is the ribbon cut, but I think it's Elsa e Tira is where you just interpose your sword between their sword and their body on the outside line, and then just come
Mhm.
back and pop them.
All right, so that's like Marazzo's rising and falling that he talks about a lot with like sword and dagger, right?
Yeah,
Same.
it's the same. It's. I will say I recently had the chance to fence with an incredibly good fencer, and
Hmm.
that was the only thing that I could pull off. Everything else I was pretty embarrassingly bad at in comparison. But I was able to do that one with some regularity, so I was pretty happy about that. So I'm thinking that's a pretty
Nice.
signature Bolognese move is to straddle the false edge over and then come back in with
Mhm.
the edge, with the true edge, right? And then it's also works with the two-handed sword. You can do the same thing, and then if they push that off, then you know in either case, once they push that off, you can just whip back around. It's pretty basic, I
Hmm.
think. I don't
I don't know. Sometimes I think of that as almost like you're kind of like beating with the false edge and then coming straight back down that same line. And if you can get them
Yeah,
back across their arms, right? So like,
yeah.
um, yeah, make it a
So
shorter tempo.
my one downside is I haven't actually got to do any cutting yet, so I'm not sure it's a legitimate move. But I kind of think like if you're cutting somebody's face, you don't have to have a super powerful blow.
Yeah. So, interesting note here. So, one of the things in teaching Mancilino that I've kind of come across is different ways. Mancilino likes to put you in these situations where he's conceptualizing essentially every cut, right? So, oftentimes Marazzo will just give you this BS of they can cut a mandrito, a reverso, or they can do a stoccata, right? And he just like
Yeah,
throws it out there. Whereas
right.
Mancilino actually will lay these things out with his defenses, and he'll like he'll give you, okay, they're going to thrust and then they'll cut a mandrito, or they're going to thrust and then they're going to cut a reverso, and then they're going to
Yes.
cut a reverso to
Yes.
your leg, or a mandrito to your leg,
Right.
and literally covers all 4 quarters and gives you
Yes.
multiple options for the ones that are most common, which I think is a fantastic way to teach.
Mancellino's grad school, and Marozzo is 4 years. So anyway.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is that it makes some of those techniques a little bit harder, right? Because you think about, like, okay, I'm going to thrust and then I've got to cut a mandrito back over top of my opponent's sword, but they're in codalung alta. So if I thrust and they do a true edge parry and then I have to cut a mandrito back across, sometimes that limits how you can do that mandrito. So
Right.
sometimes the best thing that you can do is kind of the Zukin action, where you're kind of pulling your hand back and then pushing your hand forward. There I go again, going back into KDF terms.
See, I like the other option where you get, I don't even know what the German version of this is, but you get in that situation and then you do the loop-de-loop. So,
yeah.
So you're cutting and then you loop your false edge back along their sword. So like a winding cut, I guess would be in Meyer. And then you come back in. So that's kind of my take. I don't really like pulling back and coming in, because then you have to take your sword away.
Yeah. Well, I figured as long as their momentum is heading away from your body, like if they're kind of taking their sword offline to parry a little bit, then it's not as dangerous.
You're totally safe. Yeah.
So either way, I was playing with that cut when I was first, because usually I'll teach my students like 2 or 3 different ways to do a cut, right? So I'll teach them like something that's a little bit shorter, like that Zukin type version, or I'll teach them something that's like more of sort of wrenching their sword off and then cutting back in. And then so I'll teach them both, but I was playing around with that cut to see how powerful it was. So I was cutting tatami with this sharp side sword, and I was getting like 2 to 3 inch gashes, like, just like nice solid gashes in the tatami from just kind of cocking my hand back and then just snapping it forward and driving it forward with my arm.
Okay. So basically, if we work on the, go ahead.
Well, so yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking, like, if that's the kind of damage that I could do with a technique like that, if I'm targeting their neck or their shoulder, that's probably going to be sufficient. Yeah.
So we could probably maybe follow on a basic rule, like if you can make their ears ring from that cut, then it will probably be an effective cut. There's enough force to it.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Because there's this one that we do a lot. It's pretty similar, where you start, like, you find somebody on the false edge and then you basically just kind of walk into their face. And it doesn't look like much, but it totally rings your bell if it happens to you. And I've always wondered how effective it would be at cutting. But if what you're describing is true, it sounds like pretty dang effective.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing when you put body mechanics behind sometimes some of these more simple motions, and you start to engage your hips with some of these more simple motions of the hands and stuff like that. You can make some really, really simple, stupid things just really powerful.
Okay.
But that goes back to dancing, right? Here we are talking about.
It's all about the hips. I mean, Bolognese is all about the hips, right? That's why we're a real martial art, and the other ones are fake.
Yeah. Well,
that was hyperbole. It was hyperbole.
I know. No, I'm gonna give a quick shout out to Fiore with his Mezzavolta and his Tudavolta, because he actually does a lot of engagement with the hips.
Yes.
And the other day I was looking at Vigiani, and we just started, for years we've been at KDF school, and one of our longsword instructors has started to teach Fiore, and it's like the most heretical thing that I can possibly imagine. Like, if this would have happened it wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. And so either way, he's doing this thing where he's teaching Fiore, and like the first thing that he's doing is teaching body mechanics and stuff like that. And it's a really great class. I've really enjoyed it, and he's got some really great ideas on body mechanics. I mean, first of all, he's an amazing fencer. But after that class, I went to one of his classes just kind of check out what he was doing, and because I've been on this whole, I'm going to use Vadi and Fiore to inform my Marazzo longsword thing. which, we'll see how that goes. But
Good luck with
um,
that. Yeah.
yeah, we'll see. But so I went to his class and I was doing his footwork and his drills and stuff like that, and I was like, holy crap, this is Vigiani. So I
Really?
went back. I went back
Okay.
home and I looked at all the images of Vigiani and I went through his guard section where he goes through his guards. And sure enough, man, like that's exactly what Vigiani is teaching. Is exactly what this dude is doing with Fiore. Teaching
Well, I think
Fiore's
don't the
basic
Chicago
principles.
guys do a big thing with that, like the connection between Fiore and Body and Vijani?
I don't know. I mean, I know that they
I want to.
use
I want to
I know
swear
they
I
use
read a paper about it or something like that.
I mean, when I talked to Greg just recently, well, actually, it wasn't that recent. It'll be recent for you all, but it was not recent for me. It was like 2 months ago. But I don't know what happened to June, man. It just like disappeared. Um, but yeah, when I was talking to Greg, uh, I know that they use Vigiani as a core for their body mechanics for footwork and for like delivering cuts and things like that. But we didn't talk about Vigiani and Fiore, and I wish maybe perhaps we should have. And I have not seen that information, but I imagine it probably is out there because it's not hard to draw that conclusion when you look at the images of Fiore and his turns of the body and stuff like that and the way that he
Right.
moves, and you look at the images of Vigiani, it's like almost like, oh well, it's basically the exact same thing.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the stuff that works comes from the turning. We got this. So we've been doing spear for the past couple months, which is super fun.
Oh yeah.
But like one of the guys in my group is he trained with Naginata and Japanese, and they don't do the turning and the angles that we work with. It's a very different game that they play, and it was really interesting to see how the turns of the body create these striking angles that you don't otherwise get. I mean, there's so much can happen by just turning your body. It reminds me of that picture in Agrippa. You know, the one where he has like
Hmm.
the lines all kind of going like that. It's that same basic idea. Like when you turn, you now open up this line where you kind of can come around things. And that's, I think, something that's been lost in the kind of modern sense of fencing, and it doesn't appear a lot. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's
yeah, yeah.
it's really fascinating when we did partisan because coming out of the pandemic, we were doing a lot of partisan stuff, and I know we were kind of like 4 or 5 months ahead of you guys, so it was even longer ago. But yeah, it was the craziest thing because I started. There was one day where I was fighting one of our KDF practitioners, and I hadn't really been fighting much with a two-handed sword in a Bolognese
Hmm.
style in a long
Yeah.
time. And so I was super rusty and I could tell. And I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to start fighting with the two-handed sword like it's a partisan.
Yeah.
And sure enough, dude, I just started tearing this guy to pieces. And I was just
Nice,
like,
dude.
I was like, oh man, this is
Yeah.
okay. All right. Now I'm starting
Yeah.
to unlock. This is cool.
Yeah. So those angles you create with the turns and I mean, I call it the tummy laser, which is kind of a stupid name for it, but basically, like when you point your navel in a certain direction, and the strength you can kind of create with thrusts that they go like sideways, they're really hard for people to resist that aren't familiar with the idea.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can
All
you
right.
hear
I
me?
lost you there for a second. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So it's a lot about like alta, like why that fendente works, right? So you turn in, and when somebody's stepping in, because you're in this position, you can now push at an angle over their weapon. And most people, if they haven't trained at using angles, they get pretty beat by people who can use angles to crush their weapon.
Yeah. 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 For sure. Yeah, I mean that's one of the interesting things. Like, Chris, as one of the core fundamentals of our Bolognese system, when we teach stepping on the segno, right? So,
Good. Yeah, that's great.
and segno stepping is like one of our core concepts, and the way that he teaches it is he's got 6 basic segno steps that we all learn, and you know the crazy thing about these segno steps is like the basic segno steps are essentially triangle steps
Yeah.
going all the way around a circle, right? But you're
Hmm.
still learning how to traverse a circle without ever turning your back on your opponent.
Right.
And but the interesting thing about it is that when you do these segno steps, if you start to apply them, like if you take that basic segno step where you're just kind of doing that transition of feet where you're stepping one foot this way and allowing the other foot to circle back behind, if
Yeah.
you do that with a parry, you're going to dominate any cut that comes your way, right?
Yeah. That's the anonymous basic parry.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
exactly.
like you do this and then turn your shoulder and pull your foot back as far as you can. I mean,
Yeah.
that's Bolognese 101, man.
Right. So it's crazy how like you can apply these little things. Like for example, what we do is our second segno step is we lead with the front foot. So front foot, back foot, right? And then we do the regular segno step to switch, and then we do front foot, back foot, which allows us to get that crossing step that a lot of times you see in Manciolino with his sword and large buckler, or even
Yeah.
sword and small buckler. He likes to do that crossing step with a falso. But when you do that initial forward step, so imagine that you've got your right foot forward and you start by just moving your right foot over probably like 6 inches, right? Which I think the Anonimo does this too, quite frequently, where he just says that you move it, what, like one brachio or something like that. What does he say? Or 1 foot? I can't remember.
He doesn't do a lot of cross stepping, but
No,
stepping away or
yeah,
stepping
stepping
towards a little bit.
stepping away.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like
yeah. It's like
I
step
would take
three
my right
fingers,
foot.
4 fingers.
Yeah, like 3 or 4 fingers, right? Yeah.
Right.
So like yeah, you take your right foot and you just kind of move it over to the right even
Yeah.
further, right?
Yeah.
If you accompany that step, right, whether you have right foot forward or left foot forward, and you cut from the same side against an opponent, you can deliver a cut, like a basic cut, like a mandrito or a reverso,
No kidding. I
that they
didn't
can
think about that.
easily parry. That they can easily parry. And if you
Right.
just do that slight step out of your foot, you
Yeah.
will absolutely dominate their guard and you will blast through it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just that that tiny little step of like
That's
3 or 4.
that's the advantage of the guard thing. Yeah, exactly. So because you're just that's yeah. I'm sorry, but that's exactly it. That's basically like Anonymous fundamentals, and it's like so glad to hear somebody else grasp the concept. You just move just 3 inches, and then when you move, your navel moves, and the line that your navel's on changes, and then the line that you meet the sword on changes, and you completely control that line. And
Yeah,
that's his most basic parry. He does it with a passing step from Alta, because you have to do it from Alta, and then from Stretta he just steps just like he does with Porta di Ferro Stretta. But it's the same basic action. And then you follow up with that compass step so that you end up turned like in the Palladini picture.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean that's I mean, all credit to Chris. That's definitely something that he kind of came up with and taught us. So
That's awesome.
yeah, he's
Yeah.
of course he's a fantastic instructor. But yeah, I mean it's cool though, especially like you said, like reading that kind of stuff in the Anonimo or in other sources. Like that's one of the things I love about Manciolino. Let's just this
Go back
is
to, go back
be
to how much
the
Joshua
Manciolino
loves
love face.
Manciolino.
Yeah, I know, man. Like, I don't know how this turned into a Manciolino love fest, but here we're just gonna continue to pile on. I'm sorry, but one of the things that I think is really great about Manciolino is his dynamic footwork. You know, like
Yeah.
anytime Manciolino delivers, it's always like if you're circling around to the right of your opponent, your back foot is always trailing behind, which gives you leverage, right? And if you're
Right.
doing a slicing action, if you're pushing a cut or doing a slicing action, it makes that slice even more dynamic. And then you're taking a step back to settle back and guard. And if you think about it as like, if you can catch your opponent in the tempo of them moving, you're essentially working to the side of your opponent. So their Drita Via is pointing forward, and now your Drita Via is off to their side facing at them.
Exactly.
And you
Exactly.
have all of the leverage, you have all the advantage.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
like it's brilliant, and I love that he
Yes.
does that.
So that is the geometry inherent in Bolognese swordsmanship. And it's like once you actually see it, then you see it everywhere. That's what's exciting about it. But until you actually experience it, it's kind of unclear. But yeah, you strike, and then as you turn, all of the trouble to your left is gone. So there's only trouble to your right, which is then taken care of by your false edge, and then back and forth. It's it's exactly it, man.
Well, And the cool thing is, like, you think about f- basically what we know of the Bolognese system. We know that Dardi was a geometry professor, right?
Professor of mathematics, but geometry being a subset of mathematics, presumably.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I thought in the Wichtenauer profile they put that he was mathematics, like astronomy, and then
Astrology, I think.
astrology, yeah, and then and then geometry, but I'm
Maybe
not.
you're right. I thought it was math, but either way, you're basically saying exactly what I totally 100% agree with. That Dardi is
Yes,
the one who basically took Fiore, introduced geometry to it, and turned into Bolognese swordsmanship.
that's brilliant. I love that.
That's because the Fiore was basically the representative of what was common in northern Italy at the time, and then
Hmm.
they added geometry to it, and then it became an urban art. And so, yeah, that's
Yeah, and that's where we get a lot of our line stepping, because that's the application. And that's really what, like, if you think about Fiore has great turns of the body and using body
yeah,
leverage and things like that. But a lot of what he's really good at is being very direct. And some of that may just come from fighting in armor and things like that. But what the Bolognese system takes is it takes those same basic ideas of body mechanics and turns and leverage and things like that that you can generate with your body, and then starts to add that circular footwork that
right.
allows for even more leverage and makes an even more dynamic system, which is just
Right.
brilliant.
And then the later Italians read it and said, we don't need the circular stuff. We're just going to like work on this one move and going super fast. And then the Spanish said, hey, these Italians with their circular movement are really onto something. Let's do a thing with that. And then we are where we are. That's why Bolognese
Yeah,
swordsmanship does literally represent the pinnacle of all sword development.
freaking Agrippa, man. May he
I know.
burn in hell. What a piece of shit.
Oh. Yeah,
He
so
ruined
that's
all.
he took a school, and then they basically just I don't think it's not wrong to characterize everything that follows as a simplification of something that appears in the Anonimo Bolognese. At least all the single sword work. So there's all the basic cavazione, ricavazione stuff that appears in the Italian shows up in the Anonimo Bolognese, just like the circular footwork is certainly seems implied in the Anonimo Bolognese. So yeah, that's my basis for saying the Bolognese is the pinnacle of sword art.
Yeah. So since a lot's happened since I've last talked to you, because I've talked to a lot of different people, and
Yeah.
so one of the cool things was I got to talk to Jay Maxwell, and
Oh yeah, I think I listened to that. It was a good one.
he was talking about going to visit the Anonimo in Rome.
Oh God, the Europeans, they just love to rub that in, don't they? They're
Oh
like,
man,
here
they
we
really
are with
do.
our amazing backdrop, blah blah blah.
Well,
I'm gonna go visit this 500-year-old manuscript. Yeah.
so
Oh, sorry. Anyway.
okay, all right. Another, I'm just gonna throw this out there, but on Goodreads right now, I think it was Goodreads. There's a website that sells like used books and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
There's actually a copy of Marazzo from print of Marazzo from 1560, and there's a Manciolino original that are out for sale right now.
For
Um,
reals?
yes, for reals.
How much are
Manciolino's
they?
like Marazzo's only like 4,000, which is
Only
crazy.
4,000.
Yeah, only
Wow.
4,000, which is, I think it's crazy. Like, I put a lot of value into that. If I had $4,000 to spend, I would do it, but obviously I don't,
Yeah,
because
sorry, children, you're not going to college. You're going to be studying with debt because Daddy needs a 1568 Marozzo. How much is the
Manciolino is
Manciolino?
7,000.
Oh, Lordy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But so back to Jay Maxwell, and not just like putting like fever dreams in our minds, but
Right.
so when he went to Rome and he was going to visit the Anonimo, he said that it's like you go up this like marble staircase that has like these gold railings, and there are like these gold angels like protruding from the ceiling, like blowing trumpets and stuff. And
Okay.
unfortunately, he didn't get to see it. But one of the things that he brought up that I thought was really interesting, is the idea that there's a possibility that the Anonymous was written by different authors, that it's a collation, like it's a collection of different authors.
Uh-huh.
Have you, like, I mean, I haven't seen scans of the Anonymous, so I don't know. And I don't know if that's true, but I just wanted to bring that up with you and see what
Okay,
you
so
thought.
there's definitely at least two different authors. So so the Anonymous, there's two separate manuscripts, right? And part
Yeah,
of it is definitely a copy of another part written in a different hand by a totally different person,
gotcha.
right? Okay, so there's definitely two people
So it's
involved.
just, yeah,
The other stuff,
go ahead.
to
Sorry.
me seems highly unlikely that it's more than one person, um, because there is an overall thrust to the Anonymous. So the plays come in an order that is beguilingly vague, but you know as you do it that there is a single plan behind the whole thing. It's
Hmm.
limited. I felt limited in understanding it by my own lack of knowledge, really. I mean, the sword world in which we operate is so below where they were that the knowledge, I think, is to some extent inaccessible to us, um, which I think is one of the goals that we're trying to create, is the ability to fence very, very deeply. And I believe that this is meant for people who have
Hmm.
the ability to fence like many, many intentions deep. And for us in our
Yeah.
world,
So
if you're fencing like two intentions deep, you're pretty far ahead of the next guy. And three, you're so far ahead at that point that you probably won't have much chance to grow because there's not anybody around to push you unless you travel very far.
right. Yeah, so it's really interesting you bring that up, because that's one of the things that I think drove me to Manciolino, was that
Mhm.
I realized when I started reading Anonymous that I was missing something. Like I could fight and get to, third, fourth intention sometimes. When I fight Chris, because we've been training together for so long, like we'll have these long passages where we just do these crazy things, and we'll go six or seven, eight intentions deep. But we know each other so well because we're training
Right,
partners that it's completely different. Like you can't
right,
judge like the way that you would fight with somebody else on that, because
right.
there's so much familiarity there. But when I was reading the Anonymous, I realized that I needed to kind of get in touch with the rest of the Bolognese system to really kind of have a better understanding for what I was looking at. Like the introduction alone was just like, this is on a different level. and I
Yeah.
love it. And I've used it as a framework to try to understand everything else though, like, I mean, I read the, like, going through the introduction, I've looked at like every single author's tactical ideas of what they're saying and what agrees with the Anonymous, what disagrees with the Anonymous. Most of them agree with the Anonymous in some way or the other. I couldn't
Right,
find anything that really disagrees with the Anonymous,
right.
which I thought was great. And it's something that I keep coming back to. And of course, it's not like the plays are hard to go through, but it's still like there, like you said, there's kind of like this deeper understanding of fencing there that's like, maybe I should really understand all the authors. Maybe I should understand like Dall'Agocchie, Marazzo, and Manciolino before I really kind of jump into the Anonymous and say, like, all right, let's take this to like doctorate level
Right.
fencing.
Exactly.
So I don't know.
Right. That's exactly kind of like I think where the Anonymous is at. I think is a pretty good analogy. Dall'Agocchie is the high school book, and then Morozzo is the undergrad, and is the grad school, and yeah. Anonimo Bolognese is when you get your PhD, I guess. I don't know. But it's that kind of deep and intense.
I like it.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the first 30
Yeah,
plays,
it's
there's
really good.
so much into it's so deep that like only because like I've spent so much time with it can I do that and then reference like, okay, I remember play 216 where we actually are doing this one totally random thing, and if you hadn't spent literally thousands of hours with it, like you wouldn't catch it. So it's, you have to sit with that thing and to really get it. And I feel like I only get just the slightest bit of it, which I guess is probably another reason why Dolly
Well,
Goki is
yeah, I
expensive,
mean, like,
because it's not that hard to
yeah,
understand Dolly Goki.
yeah.
There's no mystery.
So, okay, all right. So, kind of tying this all together, can we talked about rising and falling earlier, and
Yeah.
one of the things that kind of popped into my head when you were talking is like thinking like, so in play, I think it's 23 and 24, because they're pretty much the same thing. That's like just one continuous play. But you start with that imbricata, right? And you
Yes.
thrust it
Mhm.
might be play 21 that I'm thinking of, but either way, you thrust
Where he
the imbricata,
introduces Unicorn
and then
Guard.
you're
Yeah.
you're setting it up so that way you can. Yeah, and so you thrust the imbricata so that way you can do that falso and mandrito to cut back down, right?
Right.
And it's like you think about that, and it's like if you don't quite understand that that is like one of the core concepts in the Bolognese system, you don't quite get how clever that is that you're using an imbricata to set that up, right? Like you're thrusting an imbricata at somebody's hand in order to set that up to come back through. And
Right.
then like now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, holy shit, that's kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
That's a really clever way to get to that thing,
And he does it.
because
He
you can
does
do
it
that
in a
safely
number of
without ever
places there
really
in
like,
different ways. Yeah. So here's a fun thing to try. So this is kind of one of
yeah.
the things I've
So
been off on the wide
yeah.
play. So try this. So when you're working with a partner, like have them do the imbricata to your hand, and then let it reach all the way down to unicorn or to wide iron gate or to iron gate, and then launch your mandrito afterwards. Then have them do it to your hand and
Mhm.
slip it, and immediately come back in with a cut so that your cut is still falling. Um, or so that your cut is originating before while his blow is still falling, and then try the different parries there, because I think what he's actually introducing you there is this really wacky falso. I'll just use the pen to demonstrate. So if I'm here and it's coming in, it actually comes in like
Mhm.
this, like a crump out, I guess, a little bit, instead of like what we would normally do, which is you
Mhm.
come to guard here and then come up to parry. Because if it's still falling, you have to use the continual motion of the sword, or else it's going to be too slow and you're going to get hit. So that's one of the little details that
Interesting.
I've only got out of like really just bearing down and trying to do it against, and trying to really turn it into something alive, and notice that difference of striking and then the timing difference when somebody waits for you to fall in guard, and then you can do the proper falso like we all like to do, versus when they attack you and your sword is still falling, and how to do a falso in that context.
Yeah, that's really interesting because typically the way that I've gotten that to work in sparring has been just doing like a more traditional falso and mandrito, but I haven't tried to go with that sort of looping falso. But I will try that next time
And try
I.
to get somebody who does really tight timing. So basically
Well,
train your guys how to so
I
show
will.
your guys like, this is when we throw the imbricata, we're doing this because we're trying to get them to attack us so that we can hit them with the false and the mandrito. So then when you do that to them, they go, I'm not falling for that. And then show them how to use timing to then defeat that so that they're on you before your sword actually falls, and then you can defeat that with that. There's this other one right after it, a couple plays later, where you actually come in, you're on top, and then it looks like it's two thrusts. You come in with a thrust here, and then a second one, which is you make a half turn of the hand and you do a second thrust. So it's two thrusts in a row. The second one being an imbricata.
Mm.
So there's some really interesting stuff in the Anonimo Imbricata section. I'm hoping somebody's going to teach the Anonimo Imbricatas at our event in Vancouver. Um,
Cool.
So
Even more reason
yeah,
to be.
yeah. So I'd love to see, because when I look at sparring, I don't see nearly enough imbricatas going on.
Oh, you don't watch me fight enough. I'll have
Well,
to post
I don't. You're not posting video, are you?
that. No, I'm not. Yeah, no, Chris gives me a hard time all the time because I love the imbricata, but it's
Yeah.
such a good offensive guard, and he's such a good defensive fighter that I just have to kind of lead with something that's like, just kind of predictable offense.
Once you can imbricata, why go back? I mean, it's so much fun. I mean,
God, it's so much fun.
why stand an iron gate and walk in when you can put your sword in their face above them and lunge in with a
Yeah,
thrust?
yeah. Isn't that? I'm sorry. I'm gonna go back to Mancini.
Man, you got a little bromance going on with that dude.
I really do, man. I've got it. I think I'm gonna get a Mancini tattoo. Oh no. So isn't that kind of like when I can't remember this specifically. I feel like I just read this last night though when I got Swinger's translation, but in the introduction, Mancini gives a lot of this like mismatch fencer kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like he tells, and I think this is right. He tells tall people to use high guards against shorter people, right?
I'm not sure I remember that, but I mean, it certainly is a great idea.
Well, because he tells you to attack their top line, right? So he's
Right.
like your general targeting area is going to be like their upper body, whereas for a shorter person, if you're fighting a taller person, your targeting area should be their legs. So I
I mean,
think that's kind of like the
it's natural. When you strike, you're striking to the bind, and it's generally understood to be preferable to be in the over part of the bind than the under part of the bind.
right, yeah,
In
yeah, yeah.
any kind of engagement, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
And to go to the closest target too, right? So if you're
Yeah.
shorter and the closest target is going to be somebody's legs and
Right.
that's what's open, then that's what you should take. But
Right. So that's the other thing I'm hoping that we'll have at the imbricata class, which is all the ways for short people to defend themselves against imbricata. So that way they don't run away from the imbricata, and then we can actually practice the imbricata against people and the stuff that happens afterwards. Because whenever
yeah,
I try to do the imbricata in free sparring, people just back off and back off and back off, and I never get to do the fun stuff afterwards.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Dalagoki actually gives, oh, sorry.
What do I do?
Dalagoki actually gives a pretty good defense against the imbricata. He gives a few pretty good defenses against the imbricata. I mean, my favorite, honestly, when somebody goes up into Alicorno, is to just bind over top of their sword and just drive straight through their middle line. I love that.
Yeah, but you can't do that if they're like distance, and they should only be in unicorn guard if they have the distance to pull it off.
Yeah, I just find that people a lot of times, like you can almost catch them in the tempo when they're coming out of distance and they're trying to do an imbricata, and you can just kind of cut straight into it.
Yeah. So
But
I try to teach the tall people in my group, like, you enter the fight in unicorn guard. You know, there's
yeah,
none of this drawing up into unicorn guard. It's just like, that's a small person.
yeah.
Put your point in their face and stand really far away from them. And
So
they
I
have
think
no
that,
choice but to obey you.
yeah, and I think that works for me, right? Because I can kind of get over top of a lot of people's
Yeah.
Guardia del Corno, but Midge or like Delagoki's advice is to just essentially cut a mandrito into the imbricata. And I think like Palladini says something very similar. He says to cut, what does he say? It's like, it's this weird thing. It's like mandrito raddoppiato, which I kind of assume is probably like a redoubled mandrito for him. I don't know. His language is kind of skewed, but
Man, I've seen imbricata. A good imbricata crushes anything that rises into it from that direction.
yeah.
Like anything. You put your sword over it, and they try to do a thing, and you just drive their sword down, and then you
Yeah.
point towards them.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I mean, I love to use the imbricata and in sparring and then tournaments and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
it's one of my key things to do with a single-handed sword and no accompanying things. But yeah, I don't know. Just trying to think of different counters to it.
So the things that I found work best are to come at it sideways. So if you
Sideways.
Yeah, so if you start in like Codalunga stretta and you're to the inside, like your body's to the inside, but you keep your point to the outside of the imbricata, then you can actually imbricata over their imbricata.
Imbricataception.
Yeah, basically it's like, so like one's here and the other one's here. As that one's
Yeah.
coming down, you just put yours over the top of their imbricata and
Yeah. So that's essentially what I'm talking about. But you could do the same thing with a cut, right? So if you can get on the angle of it and you can get
yeah,
behind, you can
yeah, you
totally
have to get
overpower.
behind that thing,
You
right?
do. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so
we're
you never
talking
want to
about this.
stand on the inside of the imbricata because
No.
nothing good happens over there.
No. You have to get to the outside. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Although
Okay.
the
All right.
Anonymous has
We are
one
talking
where
about
what
the
you
same
do is you hang underneath it. So you come from Iron Gate and then you
thing.
hang underneath it, and it's actually surprisingly effective.
Hmm.
Because as they try to drive down, they basically just drive into your hang, and then it gets you
Mhm.
to a neutral bind afterwards. So they'll do
Nice.
this, and then they'll go, "Oh, this sucks," and cut around, and then you'll cut around, and you'll be in like a medium distance in a neutral bind, which
Yeah. Yeah.
is an improvement in your position.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty good outcome. Well, I mean, one of the things that Chris always says is like, as long as you can fail neutral, you're doing okay. You
Right.
know?
And you know what to do from neutral, then you're good. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of literature written about what happens when you fail neutral. Like
Yeah.
all of the true edge, false edge stuff. That's what happens if you fail neutral.
Right.
So, I mean,
So
there's a lot of information out there, and obviously it is something that you have to sort of study as like a level of fencing.
yes, absolutely. So that's a hope. That's another thing I'm hoping that we'll be able to cover in the class, so that people won't flee from the imbricata, and then the imbricata can lead to interesting fencing.
I love that. Man,
Because in
I'm
my
gonna
little corner of the world, it becomes just a sad little technique that nobody wants to do anything with. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, it looks so nice, and yet, but we practice in grass parks, so the space to retreat is unlimited.
Yeah. So do we. I mean,
Yeah,
we don't have a fencing hall, so
right.
we're always out in the park, but man, it
Cool.
has been, yeah, it's been a riot. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, dude, it's fun, man. This is always
I
fun.
think we'll have to check in and do this every once in a while where we just hang out and
Yeah,
just hey, cheers, man.
Bob Swords. Cheers, dude.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure. But I'll
Yeah,
let you go. I got to go
cool.
eat dinner and then go
Yeah, I
watch
gotta
the
do
Green Knight.
family stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah, so and then we're gonna be putting out some announcements about the event pretty soon and stuff. So
cool. Yeah, look forward to it. And if anybody's interested in Oktoberfest, they can check out the Triangle Sword Guild's Facebook page or their website. Just go to triangleswordguild.com and then click on events, and you'll see Oktoberfest. So
sweet.
cool, man.
All right, Joshua. Good seeing you, dude.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.
All right, take care, man.
All right, buddy.
And that concludes another episode of Le Arte Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast. Thanks again to Stephen for coming on and just having a riot with me. That was fantastic. Next week's episode, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to talk with Pike Pullen. We are going to talk about Manciolino's attacks and his counters to his attacks. We're going to talk about some sword and buckler because Pike is an amazing sword and buckler fencer. But Pike is also an amazing longsword fencer. And so I'm going to talk to Pike about the two-handed sword a little bit. And we're going to get a little bit of perspective from the other side of the argument that I've been sort of posting here about the sort of looking at the Italian sources to help inform Marazzo. We're going to start to look at what the other side of that argument kind of looks like, to look at other sources and think of Marazzo in different ways. So I'm really looking forward to that. Like I said, Pike is a phenomenal fencer, a great instructor, and a great human being. So really looking forward to that conversation. Stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.